Good evening and welcome to the annual Morehouse Lecture. The first Morehouse Lecture was delivered by the Jesuit theologian John Courtney Murray in 1962, entitled The Problem of God. Since that time, we've invited distinguished theologians to speak on topics of Christology, ecclesiology, social justice, literature, and spirituality to advance Catholic intellectual discourse on the campus of Yale University. We are delighted this evening to welcome yet another distinguished theologian to our community. Dr. Richard Gaillardetz is the Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology at Boston College and the chair of the BC Theology Department. He holds both an MA and Ph.D. from the University of Notre Dame, and in the course of his outstanding career, he has published numerous articles and has authored or edited 13 books. He was president of the Catholic Theological Society of America in 2013 and 14, and has received numerous awards from both the Catholic Press Association and the Association of Catholic Publishers. In 2000, he was the recipient of the Sophia Award, offered annually by the faculty of the Washington Theological Union in recognition of a theologian's contribution to the life of the Church. We are honored by his presence this evening as he addresses the topic, Why Belonging to a Faith Community Still Matters. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Gaillardetz.
Thank you so much, Father. What a great honor to be here. This is actually my first time to be in New Haven and to visit Yale, so it's a great opportunity for me, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate in such a distinguished lecture series. I was already intimidated when I found out my esteemed colleague Roberto Goizueta had lectured here just a few weeks earlier, and now to find out John Courtney Murray was the inaugural lecture, well, that's just pretty darn intimidating. So I have a couple of confessions to make right from the start. If you look at this title, the first confession is that my presentation tonight is going to take the form of an apologia, essentially an elaborate justification for my career. Because I am not just a systematic theologian, but I'm what we call an ecclesiologist, which is to say most of my work is in the area of the theology of the church. So I have some stake in being able to answer this question, because without it, my whole career seems to be wasted. But secondly, you're not the only audience to which these reflections are addressed. Because I want to share some reflections on the significance of ecclesial belonging, not just from the point of view of a theologian, but also from the point of view of a parent and a spouse. Because I've been having this conversation around our dinner table for a long time. My wife and I are the parents of 4 boys, ages 26, twins, 23, and 21. And if your definition of a practicing Catholic is sufficiently capacious, I would say 3 of them constitute practicing Catholics. One of them is studying neuroscience, and his concerns are less about the church and more about whether God exists. So that's a different kind of conversation I have to have with him. And then I'm married to a very committed feminist who is convinced that most of what I do is akin to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. So this whole question of why ecclesial belonging matters is not just an academic one. Right? It's a personal one for me, and one I struggle with, and one that I think actually a lot of people, even those who consider themselves very committed Christians, struggle with from time to time. All right? So it's in that spirit that I hope not to provide easy answers to this question, but to engage in one more of what needs to be a wide range of conversations that we need to have about this. So the first question I think we have to ask is, how did we get into this situation, right? So we have to recognize what a number of contemporary demographic studies have been pointing out to us over the last 10 to 15 years, but most famously the Pew Forum's study, which first came out in 2012, which mapped out in frankly depressing detail what can only be described as a mass exodus from formal communities of faith in general. In other words, we're not just talking about Catholicism. We're talking about almost any formal religious communities of faith. A mass exodus, right? but one in which, for example, if in 1987 about 1 in 14 Americans considered themselves religiously unaffiliated, what is now often known as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, now today that number is close to 1 in 5, and I was recently reading a study that says they now think the number is even lower than that, all right? Or higher, depending on your point of view. Even more disturbing is that this shift in unaffiliated status is particularly significant with millennials, ages 20 to 37, and Generation X, ages 38 to 52. And where millennials are concerned, many of whom are, of course, in this room, the Pew study reports that the unaffiliated rate is now at over 36%. This constitutes a massive pastoral and theological challenge for those of us who believe that ecclesial belonging in fact matters, because it suggests that we have utterly failed to make that case, right? We've utterly failed to make that case. But how did we get in this situation? How is it that this drop, that this massive exodus has become so dramatic over the last 5 to 10 years? Now, I'm not a sociologist of religion or a demographer, so I do not intend to provide anything like a comprehensive analysis of our situation. But I would like to propose 3 factors that I think have contributed to our situation. All right? And again, this is not an attempt to be comprehensive at all. The first factor I would propose to you has to do with institutional distrust. Right? Institutional distrust. Now, we need to situate this because I'm not just talking about distrust of the Catholic Church, for example. In fact, in a very important book written by a political scientist, Hugh Heclo, a book titled Thinking Institutionally, Heclo maps out in depressing detail over the last 50 years a growing distrust that Americans in particular have with institutions of almost any kind. And in a particularly depressing chapter that goes on for pages, he simply delineates event after depressing event starting in the 1960s all the way up to the present that maps out scandals at the area of military, having to do with politics, having to do with education, having to do with healthcare, right? And over, and you read the chapter and it just becomes cumulatively so clear why there is this, and here's the other thing, why there's this widespread distrust of institutions. But then he says, we have to distinguish this distrust, this institutional distrust, from a culture-based distrust and a performance-based distrust. So the culture-based distrust, he says, is a distrust that's just sort of in the air that we breathe. It's a kind of a larger cultural default, and it has a lot to do with what people describe as atomistic individualism, right? Or, more simply, the way in which more and more in our culture we focus on individual rights at the expense of civic obligations. Another political scientist, Amitai Etzioni, puts it more colloquially. Our situation can be summed up in one sentence. Every American insists on their right to a trial by jury, but no one wants to serve on one. Right? And there you get what we might call a culture-based distrust, a default suspicion, all right, or disinterest in institutions. But then there's another dimension of this, what Heclo calls performance-based distrust, in which, as Heclo puts it wryly, we have gained the distrust of institutions the old-fashioned way. We've earned it, right? Institutions have simply not performed well. But then he asks, and I think this is an important question, is there really any evidence that they're performing any worse today than they did a century ago? And Heclo's not convinced that they are. So what's the difference, right? In other words, if institutions are pretty much performing about the same way they've done in previous generations, why does it seem so much worse? And he posits 3 possible factors. First, he refers to the scale effect, in which he says, look, there have been scandals in the past, but modern technology has massively exacerbated the harm that institutional scandals can cause, right? So when one thinks of the millions of, or the thousands of people who were robbed of their retirement funds by somebody like Bernie Madoff, or the all sorts of people today whose financial futures are put in danger because of the Equifax leak. What we are seeing is when institutions screw up today, the consequences are much more massive than they were in the past. Does that make sense? All right, so that's the scale effect. Secondly, he talks about what he calls the display effect, which is to say, even if, and I'm not going to, by the way, try and make the case that we have no more instances of institutional dysfunction today than we did in the past. That's a complicated, and I'm not sure it's an argument that can be made. But regardless of whether there are more scandals, more dysfunction today, what's undeniable is we are more aware of them than we've ever been in the past. All right, he calls this the display effect, a situation in which we experience a media that more and more focuses in on scandal and dysfunction, seeks it out, and wants to broadcast it as much as possible. So our attention is drawn to instances of institutional distrust much more than it was in the past. And then thirdly, there's what he calls the PR effect, which is that institutions, and there's an irony here, institutions intent on protecting their reputation in response to scandal have developed professional spin, right? People who are dedicated to providing spin whenever there's a negative event or a scandal associated with an institution. But the problem is the American public isn't stupid. And after a while, we get used to the idea that the leader of the Republican Party, or the leader of the Democratic Party, or the leader of a university, or the leader of a Catholic church is going to almost instinctively try and minimize whatever harm has been caused by a particular scandal, right? And because we know that our leaders are almost instinctively going to spin something in ways that put their institution in the best possible light and minimize the dysfunction, we come to distrust them even less. Now, I'm spending a little time on this because I want you to appreciate how this culture-based distrust and performance-based distrust is part of the air we breathe. But it has been experienced in a particularly acute way, of course, with religious institutions and with the Catholic institution, right? So more specifically, we have to talk about the way that institutional distrust has been experienced in the United States. It's been experienced in many ways, but probably none more acutely and painfully than in the clerical sexual abuse crisis, right? And I kind of live in ground zero of the clerical sexual abuse crisis in Boston. And there are many people in Boston who suggest we've lost a whole generation in many ways of people who simply have been seared by the betrayal of trust that they've experienced in the church. And I think there's no way we can minimize that. So the first factor that I think we have to come to terms with is this problem of institutional distrust as it's been treated, as it's been manifested in many different ways. The second factor is what I'll call the suspicion of doctrine. Right? The suspicion of doctrine. And here, too, we can talk about this in sort of a broader point of view and look at sociological studies like the Canadian sociologist David Lyon, who published a book, I love the title of this book, Jesus in Disneyland. And I have this thing about book titles where I don't really care what's in them. I just love the title and think I could do something with that title. Right? I have no idea what the book's about. That's a great book title. In Jesus in Disneyland, however, David Lyon proposes, or he challenges, a theory that held sway in modern sociology for almost a century, sometimes called the secularization thesis. That as Western civilization became more educated, as science became more a part of our daily lives, inevitably societies would become more secular, religion would become more marginal. And Lyons pointed out that actually there's not a lot of evidence to support that, except perhaps in a few more isolated sectors like parts of Scandinavia and so on and so forth. And he says there's certainly no case for that in North America. He says that it turns out there still is a great deal of interest in religion, right? What he sees going on today is what he calls the deregulation of religion. In other words, it's not that people aren't interested in religious questions or spirituality, if you will. It's that they no longer trust the official instruments for regulating religion, right? So the traditional authority figures are no longer valued, right? So in a generation past, if somebody was looking for spiritual counsel and wanted some helpful reading, they might have gone to their local pastor. Today, we're more likely to read whatever it is that Oprah Winfrey has on display, right? And that's not to put down Oprah Winfrey in any way. It's simply to say that we are more and more suspicious of any institutional religion that proposes to regulate faith, and to regulate faith in the form of doctrine, right? And so doctrine is now associated with kind of a policing of belief, and that sort of goes against the grain for many of us. Closely related to this is what my colleague Vincent Miller refers to as the commodification of religion itself, in which Miller contends that there are a growing number of spiritual seekers in the U.S. Oftentimes they use the phrase spiritual but not religious, right? And Miller's view, and I would largely share this view, is look, these are often very sincere, well-intentioned spiritual seekers. The problem is we live in such a consumer-saturated culture that to be spiritual but not religious is oftentimes to engage religion according to the interpretive habits of consumerism, which is to say one is then inclined to think of religion as something that you go out and you pick and choose certain commodities that you find particularly spiritually meaningful or satisfying. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. He's not disparaging the intention of the spiritual seeker. See, the spiritual seeker is often genuine, wanting to find truth and meaning. And so they go along the way and they say, you know, I've had this wonderful experience of Native American smudge rituals. I'd really like to incorporate that into my spirituality. And recently I came across Sufi mystical poetry, and that's been very enriching. And I have some friends who celebrated a Seder meal, and I found that wonderful. And then recently I've taken up yoga, and I found that tremendously enriching, right? Now, in all of those instances, the spiritual seeker is absolutely well-intentioned. But what ends up happening is, of course, that they've taken elements that are embedded in religious traditions, have cut those things off at the roots, and said, I want a smudge ritual, but I'm not committed to Native American religious practice in general. I want to celebrate the Seder meal, but of course I'm not going to be Jewish and be an observant Jew, right? I love Sufi poetry, but I'm not going to commit myself to Islam. And so, though the intention is great, what ends up happening is you've turned each of these practices and beliefs into a commodity wrenched from the religious tradition in which they have their original meaning and significance, and you simply consume them. Does that follow? Now, it's very important you understand that I don't mean any disrespect to those traditions. What I'm saying is there's a big difference between practicing Islam and somebody coming along and saying, I'm really not interested in Islam, but I like this thing, and I'll take it out. And that's where you get the dynamism, this thing of commodifying religious beliefs and practices. And the final feature here in the suspicion of doctrine, where doctrines, by the way, themselves become interesting practices, all right, commodities that we can kind of latch onto, abstracted from a deep and compelling tradition. So somebody can come along and say, oh, I kind of actually like the Catholic Church's teaching on Eucharistic real presence. Or I really agree with the Catholic teaching on transubstantiation. But they'll use that term always with a capital T, often innocent of how that teaching is embedded in a centuries-long tradition of meaning and practice, where if you extract it from that tradition, you almost invariably will distort what that belief is about. All right? So this is the problem of commodification again. And then finally, as we move closer, not just to, again, these cultural patterns of commodifying religion, but what's gone on in the Catholic Church, regardless of one's ideological position, what is undeniable over the last 50 years is a growing experience of widespread dissent in the Catholic Church regarding certain doctrinal matters. Going back to 1968, with the Church's teaching on birth control and Humanae Vitae, 1994 with Pope John Paul II's apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotalis on the ordination of women, the Church's teaching on the status of LGBTQ persons, its opposition to same-sex marriage. Often note, almost all of these instances where there are instances of dissent are concerned with questions of sexuality and gender. right? And without weighing in at all on the truth or falsity or problematic character of those teachings, it is an empirical fact that wide swaths of the American church no longer embrace all of those teachings, which has simply in another way led to a kind of diminishment or suspicion of doctrine is in some ways simply not helpful at all. Does that make some sense? All right. Lastly, I would argue that we are suffering from what we might call the fragilization of religious identity. And I take this term from the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, whose massive book, A Secular Age, which I recommend to you, but with a certain caution that reading this 850-page tome is not unlike experiencing a bunch of angels coming down and pumping fog into a room. But if one can plow through this book, it's worth the effort. But what animates the volume is really one very simple question. How did it come to be that 500 years ago in the Western world, belief in God was simply a given? That nobody asked questions. Now, that doesn't mean everybody was observant. That doesn't mean that everybody acted in accord with that belief. But belief in God was simply a given 500 years ago in the West. It was what Taylor calls, it was part of their social imaginary. The thing you didn't think about because everybody knows that, right? How did we move from a situation like that 500 years ago to the situation today where our age is secular? And for Taylor, secular here doesn't mean the evacuation of religion. So he doesn't think of secular as having a negative valence, as a lot of people do. He says our age is secular in its primary meaning simply because of this. Religious belief is still possible today, but it's one option among many. And that is an unprecedented situation historically. And so what happens when those of us who do profess belief in God and live out of that belief deal with the fact that we have meaningful friends, family members, colleagues at work, and neighbors who don't share our belief? And yet we find them to be wonderful, upstanding people whose lives seem to be quite satisfied. They're quite content in this situation. And Taylor says what ends up happening is one of two things. Either you become a fundamentalist, you double down on certitude in which you're right and everybody else is going to hell, or your religious identity will become more transparently fragile, right? You can't hold it with the same kind of certitude because there are too many good people you know and love who don't share your viewpoint. And so identity has become more fragile. All right? Okay, again, my intention here was not to be comprehensive in a way, but to map out some contributing factors that I think are leading to this disaffiliation from formal religious tradition. All right? And note that many of these things don't amount to a critical judgment on individuals who find that they no longer need the church. In fact, there's a way in which one can quite reasonably understand why a lot of people might have come to that conclusion. I don't seem to need to be a part of this institution. But I'm not entirely ready to give in to that situation without in any way standing in judgment on people who, following their conscience, have felt the need to exit, to depart from formal affiliation with a religious tradition, who have, as Patrick Hornbeck and Tom Bedoin provocatively put it, have decided to deconvert from religion. I want to respect that decision. Nevertheless, I also want to argue that there are important reasons why ecclesial belonging does still matter. But if we're to make that case, it seems to me there's some work that's going to have to be done by those of us who belong to a religious community of faith. All right? It's not, in other words, the argument can't just be, why can't you see that everything is wonderful in this community and just join us? I'm reminded of the Catholic Church's approach to ecumenism in the 1920s. Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical in 1928 titled Mortalium Animos. And he gave this sort of official version of Catholic ecumenism. We're right, you're wrong, come back to us. That's what we call an ecumenism of return. And may I suggest to you that in our contemporary situation, that kind of language isn't going to get us anywhere. Right? The we're right, you're wrong, you're fundamentally mistaken isn't going to get us anywhere. All right? So what do we need to do here? I want to propose that I'm going to try and leave some time here for a discussion because these are all kind of tentative, ongoing reflections on what I think is a serious challenge facing our church today and, frankly, almost all religious communities in the West today. I want to offer three kind of features that we need to think about. We need to ask ourselves, how can we make this case a little bit better? And what needs to change within our communities of faith if this argument is going to have any real purchase? So the first one I want to say is that ecclesial belonging relies on the fundamental value and essential reformability of religious institutions. All right? So first, I want to talk about the fundamental value of institutions, because the fact of the matter is that we need institutions to flourish. Right? We may be jaded about them, but we need institutions to flourish. Why? Because institutions represent our instinct that the sum is always greater than the parts, right? And that what we can do together is always greater than what we can do alone. Institutions are what allow us to maximize our gifts and ability to enhance and expand our fundamental convictions and values. And so to live in a society in which institutions are fundamentally bereft of value and respect is to live in a society in which human flourishing is itself compromised. And the problem is it's difficult for people to appreciate that, right? It's perhaps better if we ask ourselves, not thinking about religious institutions, but look at the state of our political discourse and say, surely we can agree whether we lean to the left or lean to the right, that there's something deeply toxic in our culture that has led so many Americans to simply give up on our political institutions, to not vote, to not bother to be interested, right? To not bother to engage in political conversation, because what point is there to it? Right? And I think we can recognize that our society is diminished when that happens. We need to make that same kind of argument about religious institutions without in any way minimizing the dysfunction of those institutions and indeed even occasionally their toxicity. We have to hold up the tremendous promise that institutions, including religious institutions, have for personal flourishing. But we can't do that today unless we also acknowledge, much more forthrightly than the Catholic Church anyway has been willing to do, the second part. If there's a fundamental value to institutions, we must also insist on the essential reformability of religious institutions. And that has always been a problem in the Catholic Church. Why? Well, because we have a very dense account of the sacramentality of the Church. As the Second Vatican Council taught us, the Church itself doesn't just administer sacraments, it is a sacrament, right? The Church itself has both human and divine dimensions to it. Now, that has unfortunately led some people in the Church to say the Church itself can't be reformed, right? Before the Second Vatican Council, that was considered a heresy to suggest you could reform the Church. How can you possibly reform the mystical body of Christ, right? How can you perform a church that before Vatican II was referred to as a societas perfecta, a perfect society? And then the Second Vatican Council came along. And the Second Vatican Council reminded us that that same church is not only the mystical body of Christ, but it is a pilgrim church. Not just a church of pilgrims, where its individual members are on a journey in which they haven't arrived yet, but the church itself, the church qua church, is pilgrim. The church itself has not yet arrived. And so as Lumen Gentium Article 48 taught at the Second Vatican Council, the church will not achieve its perfection until the end of history. Until Jesus returns, in other words, it will always be in need of reform and renewal. And where before Vatican II, Catholics had become so habituated to speaking of the church as possessing the truth, as if we had it in our back pocket and could pull it out, right? In any religious debate, Dei Verbum 8 in the Second Vatican Council document says, the church, through the guidance of the Spirit, is always moving toward the fullness of truth. We don't have it in our back pocket. We are always living into it. Or perhaps a better way of putting it, less that we possess the truth than that we are possessed by it, right? This requires, it seems to me, much more humility about the way in which our church, human and divine, must be subject, nevertheless, to reform and renewal. Now, our church leaders have generally been open to that. That is, they've been willing to talk about individuals who have failed, individuals who have sinned. But the church leadership has generally been reluctant to say that the church itself is not only holy, but sinful. And yet there are more and more theologians are saying until we come to terms with the idea that there are not just individual sinners in the church, but sinful structures in the church, policies and institutions that themselves, often inhabited by people with great intentions, nevertheless can perpetuate harm. Until we recognize that and clearly manifest to others our appreciation that the church will always be in need of reform and renewal, it will be very difficult to recover the credibility of the church as an institution. So that's the first. Second, ecclesial belonging requires us to wrestle with the demands of communal belief. So what am I after here? Here I want to take on, from that previous slide, the second point I made, not just about institutional dysfunction. The first one's responding to that. This one is responding to the suspicion of doctrine. How can we rehabilitate the role of doctrine in the church? And my view is we need to rehabilitate it, because while I do not believe our church is in the first instance a church about doctrine, or actually I would argue that belonging to the church is more about a way of life, a set of practices, than it is about doctrine. Nevertheless, I would argue that doctrine does play an important role, a secondary one, I believe, but nevertheless an important one. And it does so in positive ways. For example, ways in which it distills and clarifies the fundamental meaning and intention of our basic practices and intuitions about what it is to follow the way of Jesus, but also because of the way in which communal beliefs force us to wrestle with our faith. And that's the part that I want to put forward to you today. One of the reasons why I think doctrine has become discredited in our church is because it has been offered to us in sort of a binary or a juridical key. Believe it or not. Heretic or Orthodox believer. Are you in or are you out? Right? And in reaction to that kind of all or nothing, obey or you're disobedient, right? You're either Orthodox or you're a heretic. That's what I mean by the binary thing. A lot of people have said, well, I can't buy into that, so they throw the whole thing out. I'm not interested in it at all. All right? Whereas what it seems to me church doctrine does for us and ought to do for us is it pushes back against the tendencies of a commodified religion. I want to go back to the situation of the spiritual seeker, right? Who is disillusioned about religious institutions, as we point out, has good reason to be disillusioned about religious institutions, and simply says, I don't need it anymore. I'm going to go on my own, right? I'm going to develop my own spiritual journey and draw on resources that I find helpful. I have no doubt about the well-meaning intentions of that person. But here is the undeniable tendency in a culture that commodifies everything, is, as I pointed out, it will turn religion into a commodity in which you will almost instinctively be drawn to those beliefs and practices that reinforce your fundamental insights and intuitions, that will reinforce your political preferences, that'll reinforce your preconceived notions about what's important about human relationships, politics, our obligations to one another. And one will be inclined in a commodified culture like that to simply leave aside every belief, every practice that one finds even moderately problematic. All right? Now, for some people, that's a problem of dissent and faith, but I want to argue it's more a problem of conversion. Do we believe that part of belonging to a community of faith is not just that we are sustained and comforted by our tradition, but that it should trouble us in ways that sometimes call us to reassess our viewpoints and attitudes, that call us to conversion? So, to demonstrate what I'm talking about, I'll do a little thought experiment here, and I'm going to try and take a teaching that's kind of not as frequently talked about as something like birth control or homosexuality. Hopefully this will be a little less problematic. And I want to say from the start, I'm less interested in talking about the teaching itself than how people engage it. Does that follow? So we're going to do a little thought experiment about two people, Michael and Marie. Michael and Marie were recently received into full communion in the Catholic Church at their local parish. They are very active Catholics. They're excited about becoming Catholic. They go to Mass regularly. They sign up for everything they can. They're a lector. One's in a choir. They're not married to one another, by the way. They just came into the process at the same time. And they've recently heard that their parish is doing an adult education program, sort of Catholicism 101, and they can't get enough of this stuff. So they signed up. They're going to do the 8-week series that their pastor's teaching. And they're eating it up. They're the ones asking the question at each time the pastor, as he's teaching the class. The pastor's scared to death by them because he's barely 1 week ahead of the class doing this. This wouldn't be your pastor here. This would be a more modest intellectual figure. But he's got 6 weeks through and he's in pretty good shape, right? He's got the 7th class. He's teaching the 2nd class. He's gone through social ethics. Now he's going to deal with bioethics. And he talks about something that throws Michael and Marie off their game. He talks about how the Catholic Church is opposed to the use of in vitro fertilization to conceive a child. And both of them go, whoa, this never came up when we were preparing to be received in full communion. How did I never hear this? And Michael, I should tell you, is furious about this. And he goes to the pastor afterwards. He says, this is why I almost didn't become Catholic. Because as much as I love the liturgy, as much as I love the communion of saints in its history, whenever we get to the pelvic issues, you can count on the Catholic Church to screw it up. And he marches out and he says he's never coming back for another class. All right? Marie is a little more cautious, but she goes up to the pastor and she says, Father, I got to tell you, I'm a little concerned about this. I'm mostly puzzled because I remember when we talked about the sacrament of marriage, one of the central features, and I found this very attractive about the Catholic teaching on marriage, was the importance of one being generous with one's love. Thank you. One being generous with one's love, and that meant being open to bringing children into the world. Here we have a technology intended to help a couple be generous in bringing new life, and you're telling me it's wrong. And the pastor goes, yeah, I'm not so sure about that either. Why don't we, he says, however, that the Vatican issued a document about this a few years ago. Why don't you and I agree we're going to read this document, go home, and we'll come back in a couple weeks to talk about it. She says, okay, we'll do that. So she goes home, she reads the document, she comes back and she says, Father, I'm really glad you asked me to read that statement because it got me thinking about a lot of things. One of the things that got me thinking about, and I'll be honest, I'd never really thought about this before, was the danger, particularly with heterologous in vitro fertilization. That's a fancy term for what happens when we use donor sperm and donor ova. The danger that against our intentions, we might be turning children into a commodity that we order through catalogs. And I'd never really thought about that. And I have to admit, that gives me pause. I think there's some insight in this teaching. But I'm not 100% convinced because I can still imagine there might be some pastoral situations where this would be indicated. And her pastor says, yeah, I think you've got some good points there. And to be honest, I need to think about this more. And, I'll tell you what, I'll even bring it up with the bishop the next time we do an ongoing education for clergy thing. Because I think this is a more complicated issue than our official teaching recognizes. Now, look, there are people who would tell you that Michael and Marie, at the end of the day, are in the same situation. They have both dissented because neither of them can fully embrace the teaching of the church. But I would argue they are in two very different situations. Michael simply ignored a teaching that prima facie seemed silly to him. Marie allowed herself to be troubled by the teaching, to wrestle with the teaching, to allow it to challenge her preconceived notions, but of course she argued back with it too. And she didn't find herself fundamentally agreeing with it. But she was changed by her determination to take her tradition seriously. Now, that's a different way of thinking about doctrine than many of us are accustomed. That's not a checklist. Can you go down the list and put a check by every teaching? That's simply saying we are called to be part of a tradition that doesn't always tell us what we want to hear, but sometimes calls us to conversion. Now, it's also a situation in which sometimes we might have to follow our conscience and say, I have wrestled with this, but here and now I'm not sure I can accept it entirely. But I'm committed to stay in this community, to continue to be part of that conversation, to continue to struggle, to challenge and be challenged. This is, I would suggest to you, a very different way of thinking about the role of doctrine than those who use it in service of kind of orthodoxy police tactics to decide who's in and who's out. Does that make sense? All right. Lastly, because I want to make sure we have some time for you all to disagree with me on this. Ecclesial belonging offers a pedagogy of desire. Now, this needs to be unpacked a little. So there was a time when the Catholic Church could probably argue for the importance to be Catholic based on the notion of salvation. No salvation outside the church. But of course, the Second Vatican Council problematized that a bit when it recognized that there was goodness and truth in other religious traditions and that salvation was not necessarily excluded to non-Catholics and even non-Christians, right? And so this sort of Catholic triumphalism, we're right, you're wrong, you can only find salvation and truth here, everywhere else you're going to hell, that argument, of course, loses its purchase. So then the question is, well, so how do we think about the need or value of belonging if it isn't about we're the exclusive suppository of grace, repository, not suppository. Just purge that from your religious imaginations, if you would. It's too late, isn't it? All right. The exclusive repository of I don't know if I can get through this now. Of truth and grace. If we set that aside, what do? Well, one of the ways in which I think some theologians have been tackling this, and I find it more and more compelling, is a retrieval of a basic insight that goes all the way back, frankly, to St. Augustine of Hippo, in which St. Augustine understood, and here I'm influenced very much by the reading of a Reformed theologian, just because it's the academic in me. I feel like I have to footnote everything. So I want you to know none of this is original. I just steal from the best. But James K.A. Smith, a Reformed theologian, has offered a lot of insight on this, and much of what I say is drawing from him. Augustine's insight was that, and this goes to what we call theological anthropology, which is a fancy term for how do we make sense of what it means to be human. And I think one of Augustine's great intuitions is our humanity is not primarily grounded on the person as thinker, right? We don't, as a church, think about humans in terms of being thinkers. Though there are a lot of Christians who want to do that and want to think that Christianity is ultimately about ideas. And they want to argue about ideas against people who have other ideas. Nor does being human primarily reside in what we believe. It's not the human as thinker, where it's all about ideas, nor is it even the human as believer, where it's about beliefs that we have and they don't have. We believe in real presence, they don't, that kind of thing. Rather, what Augustine argued was, at the core of the human person is the question, not what do you think, not what do you believe, but what do you love? The human person as lover. Another way of putting this is, For St. Augustine, everybody is a liturgical animal. Everybody worships. The only question is, what do you worship? Right? And so the fundamental way of thinking about human existence is to ask the question, what do I love? Or who do I love? Or another way of getting at this is, what do I desire? What do I long for? And the point here is that we all worship. We all desire. And I should point out that we live in a culture, and I hate to bash on consumerism, but the fact of the matter is we live in a culture in which our economy is predicated on the manipulation of desire, right? That is, our entire economy is based on the idea of convincing you that this is what you really want, right? And then making sure your desire is nomadic, that you're never sated, right? So I remember the first time I had one of these things about, 20 years ago, and it was really quite quaint because it could only do one thing, take and receive phone calls, right? And so in order to get me to buy a new cell phone, it had to add new functions and convince me I needed a cell phone that allowed me to check my email. And then it had to convince me to get another one. I needed a cell phone that can allow me to take pictures and to watch pictures. And eventually I needed a cell phone that allows me to figure out how many yards from the pin I am on the 14th fairway at Inverness in Toledo, Ohio, right? And each time, of course, my desire is nomadic because it convinces me I have to go on to the next thing and the next thing, right? And by the way, when they can no longer convince me to desire something new by adding new functions, well, you do the next best thing. You factor in fashion or style. So now what convinces you to buy something new is what you wear is still usable, but it's not in style. As my friend Vince Miller says, this is, after all, Victoria's real secret. Because you can't add functionality to lingerie. You can only change fashion, right? So we live in a culture which manipulates our desire over and over. And in such a culture, what does it mean to be Christian? What it means to be Christian is to submit to a pedagogy of desire, to be part of a community that is a school of discipleship, that invites me into a set of practices and stories and symbols and teachings that has one purpose: to teach me who and how to love and to do so properly, to order my capacity to love. Do I belong to this community because it's the only way to experience salvation? No. Is it the only repository of truth? No. I'm part of this community because I believe this community, when entered into fully, helps train my desire, helps teach me who to love and how to love in accord with the one who loved us into our very existence. And so our basic practices and convictions and commitments are ultimately about the training of desire, learning how to love as God loves us. And that's a lifelong journey. And so I'd like to close with an excerpt from a homily by a very, influential theologian named Robert Hovda, who was convinced that that's ultimately what the Eucharist is about, what you just celebrated. That the Eucharist is, he believes, ultimately about training us in how to love. What he calls playing the reign of God. That whenever we gather at the Eucharist, we are playing God's reign. We are acting as if God's reign had been realized. We are living ritually and as if the lion were now lying down with the lamb. As if even now we were hammering pitchforks, right? What is it? Swords into plowshares. I've lost the metaphor right there. It was working real well for a while. So to celebrate the Eucharist, and I would argue to be a part of the church, is ultimately to submit to a community in which we, in all humility, seek to play the reign of God. And so he writes, where else in our society are food and drink broken and poured out so that everybody shares and shares alike and all are thereby divinized alike? Where else in this world of ours do economic czars and beggars get the same treatment? Where else are we all addressed with the proclamation of a word that we believe to be God's word and not merely our own, and before which we all stand as equal? Where else in our society are we all sprinkled and bowed to and incensed and touched and kissed and treated like somebody in the same way? This thing we do when we gather at this table is nothing less than playing the reign of God. So let's be honest with one another. We're not here because we're rich, or because we're good looking, or because we haven't got any police record, or because we were good kids and well behaved in school. We're not here because we own a block of property down the street, or because we've got a good job, or because our car is new, or because everybody in our neighborhood thinks we're nice. We're here because we are sinners, and we dare to believe in a God who loves sinners. And so we believe that what God requires of us, what God asks of us, what God invites us to, is anything we can do to help make people a little more free, a little more conscious of their oneness and their need for one another. For that is love. That is gospel morality. That is what Jesus called being perfect. Thank you.
Your challenging remarks. We have time for just a few questions before we conclude. Just to start, just please line up here on the microphone if you want to ask a question. You began your remarks by talking about the contributing factors that led to institutional distrust. If a bishop was to call you into his office and say, "What can I do in my diocese to restore institutional trust?" what advice would you give him?
Thank you for that.
Line up here.
Let me move to another continent where it'll seem a little less threatening. I was just down in Australia, in a church, by the way, that has been racked by clerical sexual abuse every bit as much, if not more, than here in the U.S., and in which there's a royal commission that has just excoriated Catholic Church leadership for its failures, and their leading cardinal is currently being indicted for crimes that may well put him in prison. It is a church suffering a grievous morale problem. And they have recently announced, their bishops have recently announced their intention in 2020 to convene a plenary council, a council of the entire Church of Australia, only the fifth in their history and the first time in 80 years. We haven't had one in almost a century, maybe more than a century. And I was on a panel with Archbishop Mark Coleridge, who is the one in charge of planning it. And he and I had a discussion about the possibility and the opportunity for that council. And I said, I think it's a tremendous opportunity that brings with it a tremendous risk. I said, if you hold this plenary council and do not honestly and forthrightly deal with the failings of the church, you may lose the people for a generation. But if you take this opportunity to engage in a formal and communal ritual of repentance, in which you confess before the people and before your country how the church and its leadership has failed, then I think there's a chance of restoring the credibility of the institution. People have a tremendous capacity to forgive when they sense genuine contrition. But if you recall the PR effect, we have become jaded by leaders who try to spin and minimize and say, well, that's all well and good, but we need to look to the future. We need to go beyond all of this, right? And I think people are fed up with that. They want to believe in the church as an institution. I really believe that. But they need to believe that the church understands and its leaders understand how significantly the church's reputation was defaced by what's happened, right? By a kind of complacency, moreover, where church leaders and pastors, present company clearly excluded, were often complacent and simply assume Catholics are going to come because they've always come. We don't need to listen to them. We don't need to attend their needs. We simply need to go through the motions, do the things the way we've always done. And that's not going to work in the church today. And so I have a tremendous passion and love for our faith, but I think we're going to need to adopt a position of humility and repentance and trust that the people of God and our larger society will recognize the sincerity of that and walk with us in a pilgrimage where we then are in a situation to move forward and to respond to God's call to be followers of Jesus.
Thank you, Professor. I really loved your example of the Michael and Marie and their different reactions to this course on Catholicism that they were going through. And I was just thinking that would be a great parish where there's this course that's happening for 8 weeks and the pastor is putting in all this effort. And I think that what a lot of sort of college students who have had a really wonderful campus ministry and then are getting ready to go into parish life worry about is finding a parish that's going to have programming like that and a pastor who's going to respond in the way that your story represented. And just thinking about the rhetoric of commodification, you hear a lot about parish shopping.
Right.
And so I'm wondering about your thoughts about shopping for a parish or just advice for young people who are facing that dilemma.
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's such a tough one to answer because everything I would have just said to you earlier would lead you to believe that I'm utterly opposed to parish shopping. But I'm not. Because I do think at the end of the day, we have to find a community that in some way is life-giving, that finds a place where we ourselves, and particularly, if we have family, where they can be nourished, right? Now, once we do that, I do think it's important to make a commitment because there is no perfect community. There is no community that meets all of our needs. And ultimately, I'm not convinced that communal belonging is about meeting our needs. But certainly one element of it has to be that the gospel is proclaimed, the sacraments are celebrated, we're invited into the life of discipleship and sent forth in mission. And we need a community that at least in some way is not just going through the motions in that regard, or is not so toxically distorting the gospel that people feel like their very dignity is being challenged by harsh and judgmental and rigid and exclusive presentations of our Catholic faith. So some degree of, I would prefer not to call it shopping, but ecclesial discernment, right? It seems to me warranted. But I do think we have to be careful about that because it can turn into just finding the place that has the best music or empties the parking lot out quickest or something like that. So what we're looking for matters as much as the discernment itself. If it's just, I want a message that makes me feel good every Sunday and that's it, that's the commodification. If I want a community I can commit myself to and share my gifts and know that I'll be called to be my best self, that's a different kind of thing. That's an entirely appropriate discernment for adult baptized followers of Christ. Thank you for that. Please come to the microphone.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question has to do with the changes of sociality we've witnessed, particularly with the ascendancy of digital culture, digital media, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that ecclesial belonging is by now much more complex and deeper than brick and mortar communities alone, which you seemed to imagine. Mm-hmm. Would you speak to an ecclesial belonging beyond brick and mortar sanctuaries?
Sure. Thank you for that. This is a very live question in my field. I'm a little nervous about what may lie behind that question, so I just published a piece in an online journal I'm hoping you're not responding because you read it. So I'm always afraid this is the person who wrote the article I disagreed with. So there's a book that came out by a theologian named Deanna Thompson, who I really admire, on the virtual body of Christ. And I disagree with her. Okay, well, good. So we know, I wasn't off base here anyway. We are talking about the same thing. So Deanna Thompson wrote a book called The Virtual Body of Christ, and it's a very powerful book, and I was part of a syndicate online kind of panel discussion, and she gave me pause. It's really a beautiful testimony, because this is a woman who's a cancer survivor, and talked about how her experience of the website Caring Bridge, is that what it's called? Caring Bridge, gave her a palpable experience of church on the internet, right? As people were able to communicate with her, their prayers for her, and so on and so forth. And I thought there was a lot in that book that forced my instinct has been to be very nervous about virtual community. I have my suspicions about it, and I have to admit, she forced me to imagine that there are elements of virtual belonging that could extend and enhance our experience of community. But I'm very nervous about supplanting, entirely supplanting enfleshed or embodied encounters. But I will say, I think this is a very important question going on in theology today, and I'm conflicted as well. And some of it I want to recognize may even be generational, that I have a fundamental kind of preferential option for community mediated through physically embodied presence. But there's a lot going on in people's reflection on virtual technologies that helps me appreciate it's a little more complicated than that. So I'm waffling on this because I'm conflicted myself. I am suspicious of virtual communities that relieve us of the obligation to physical embodied presence with one another, because I think there's a vulnerability that happens in physical embodied presence that is difficult. I'm not going to say impossible, but difficult to emulate in virtual modalities. But I appreciate the question. As you can tell, I'm still working through it.
You have to get in your car and drive in the rain.
Right.
Stay home. I want to thank you for your presentation. Feel free to ask other questions of our speaker tonight as we conclude. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.